Hey, what's up, everybody? This is D back again with MKD58 Media. I got another movie review for you guys, and this movie review is going to be for the 2001 film From Hell. All right, now this movie is directed by the Hughes brothers, which is actually for me a very surprising, interesting bit of trivia that I didn't know about till after I had watched the movie. And I say all that because for me, the Hughes brothers are most famous for directing Menace to Society, which is, you know, like a hood classic or whatever. So From Hell is a big change of pace. And I was just really surprised to find out that they did this movie. So directed by the Hughes brothers, it's starring Johnny Depp and Heather Graham. Ian Holm is in this film. And you remember back in the day at this point in time, there was a point where Heather Graham was really being pushed. She was kind of like an it girl of sorts. I remember there was a time period where she was very much sort of an it girl on the Hollywood scene. So her and Johnny Depp are kind of like, in terms of star power, are kind of like the centerpieces of this movie. So From Hell, basically what this movie is about, Johnny Depp plays Fred Aberline, who is an inspector in Victorian era London during the Jack the Ripper murders, you know, the famous Jack the Ripper serial killer. And so he's trying to, Aberline is trying to solve these murders and basically bring down Jack the Ripper, who, you know, Jack the Ripper is a serial killer who, during a short time period in London, killed about 5 or so prostitutes and went on to mutilate their bodies in some really kind of horrible ways. And he was never, my understanding is that he was never caught, you know, and they actually never figured out his true identity. From what I understand, and I think there's been a few specials where they've kind of hinted at they figured it out who it was, but I don't know if that was ever confirmed. So to my knowledge, the guy was never caught and his identity was never figured out. So Johnny Depp is trying to solve this case. And Aberline he's an inspector who likes to get high on opium. And when he's high on opium, he has these kind of visions and almost kind of these visions that almost kind of predict or give him hints at future victims and locations of the crimes and things like that. So he uses these opium-induced visions to help him solve the case and to find clues and to kind of get further into the case. But this is actually, opium-induced visions aside, this is actually Johnny Depp's, for me, one of his more understated performances, in terms of he's not really playing a very overtly quirky, weird character. You know, he's not doing the Jack Sparrow thing. He's not doing the, you know, Willy Wonka type thing. He's just kind of playing it pretty straightforward, you know, especially compared to what I usually see Johnny Depp do. He plays his character pretty straightforward, and I appreciate it. I thought it was a good performance. So far, this is toward the top of the list as far as being one of my favorite Johnny Depp films. So what I think about this film, I like this film. The big plus for me about this movie, and you know this is always important with me with this type of subject matter, the big plus is the very dark, gothic, moody, atmospheric mood of this film. The visuals, the setting, Victorian era London is just a time period that's just very rich with kind of gothic visuals and imagery, moody, atmospheric imagery. So I really kind of just enjoyed that aesthetic with this movie. Just lots of really nice shots of kind of the London skyline silhouetted against a blood red sky. You know what I mean? Just lots of visuals like that really kind of hit home and really drove home the mood of this movie. So that was the really big plus for me. This movie is also a R movie, and it's a hard R. This movie steps very confidently into its R rating. This is a bloody, brutal movie. There are things that you see outright that are bloody and graphic and brutal, and there are things that are simply implied that are even more brutal and disturbing in nature and things like that. So, in this movie embraces that, steps fully into that. It doesn't try. This is not a movie for kids at all. There's some horror movies, I talked about it with Tremors, how that's kind of introductory horror and things like that. You feel completely fine letting a child watch that movie. This is a movie, no kids allowed, in my opinion. I'm not, if I don't have any kids, but I'm not, if I had kids and stuff like that, I'm not letting them watch From Hell, you know what I mean? So that's what I will say about that. This movie fits very well into the horror genre. I've seen it described as a slasher. It's actually a movie that kind of has a little bit of multiple genres, because it doesn't, while this hits all the beats and characteristics of a horror film, it's not really necessarily, it doesn't necessarily feel like a traditional, just straightforward horror movie. Has elements of a slasher, but it doesn't really feel like a slasher, straightforward slasher film. It just has elements of that. But it's so dark and graphic in its nature, and so kind of brutal, and up to a certain point has the element, the very huge element of mystery as well. That's a part that doesn't kind of get touched on quite as much, is that this up until a point, because they do reveal who the killer is eventually, and I actually was disappointed by that. I'll get back to that in a minute. But up until a point, this is a very much also a mystery movie as well. So this movie manages to kind of dabble in multiple genres and not really kind of commit to any of them fully, other than horror. But horror is a genre that can have so many different type of vibes within that, because even comedy can fit into horror. So, but this movie is firmly a horror movie for me, and it's interesting because I don't hear a lot of horror fans talk about this movie. There's a lot of content creators, movie content creators, and movie critics, reviewers, and things like that I pay attention to, and a lot of them are into horror and things like that. Some of them are solely into horror, specifically into horror, and I haven't heard any of them, not to say that they haven't, because it's not like I've watched every video, but I haven't heard any of them talk about From Hell. And I'm kind of surprised by it, because one, the movie's actually very well made, a very good looking movie, stylistically very good, and even from an acting performance perspective, it's well done. But also the fact that it's talking about Jack the Ripper, who is this kind of almost, I don't want to say iconic, but just like super infamous legend of sorts in the kind of serial killer world and things like that, and just and from a time period that's very, like I said, very rich with atmosphere and mood and imagery and architecture and things like that. So it's kind of surprising that more of the movie fans haven't kind of lifted this movie up and kind of talked about it more and given it more praise, because I actually do think it's worthy of more praise than it's received. Now, with that being said, I mentioned earlier I did not like who the killer ended up being. This is where the movie kind of dropped. Well, there's two areas where the movie doesn't work for me. I'll talk about this area first. Who they reveal the killer, who they reveal, quote unquote, Jack Ripper to end up being in this movie does, and I'm not going to reveal that, because there's some things I don't care about spoiling in certain movies. For this, I don't want to reveal who this killer is. I feel like if you haven't seen the movie, I want you to figure that out, find that out on your own, draw your own conclusions and things. But who it ends up being is just completely underwhelming for me. It just does not work for me at all. I won't go into specifics about why it doesn't work for me, because to do that would be to spoil who the killer is, but it just doesn't work for me, just from a just style perspective, believability perspective, from what I was shown throughout the whole movie leading up to this kind of reveal and things like that. It just doesn't vibe with me. I wasn't a fan of who they revealed the killer to end up being, because who they revealed it to end up being didn't really match the silhouette of the figure of who they were showing doing these killings throughout the movie, if that makes sense. I know I can't be the only one who saw this movie and was like underwhelmed by who the killer ended up being. I know I'm not the only one. But also, so there's that. And the second thing about this movie that didn't work for me is I just could not bring myself to care about Johnny Depp and Heather Graham's budding romance. You could tell they were starting to like each other and were kind of getting towards a point where they were, falling for each other a bit. And I just couldn't bring myself to care. Those were the scenes that I actually literally zoned out on. There were moments where they would be kind of, talking and gazing into each other's eyes, and you could tell they were kind of trying to build up the rapport and the budding romance between those two. And those were the moments that I just found myself zoning out on. There was a few times where I actually had to zone back in and like, oh shit, I gotta rewind, because during that scene I might have missed some important dialogue, and during that boring ass walk and talk conversation they were having, she might have said something important or something. So let me rewind and actually force myself to watch this scene that I don't actually really care about, but let me watch it because I want to make sure I get all the information, that's important to the plot and things like that. So that's what was going on a lot with the Heather Graham, Johnny Depp kind of romance type scenes. It's just I couldn't really bring myself to care too much about it. And that was the points of the movie that just didn't entertain me at all, was the romantic subplot that they tried to get into a little bit in this film. But other than that, everything else worked for me. This movie is graphic and bloody. It's disturbing. It's just some brutal things are being done. Some brutal things are going on. But, I mean, considering the story and who the killer is and Jack the Ripper and what we know him to have done and all of that, I mean, that's not a negative for this movie. You got to kind of have that brutality there. And not all the brutality is shown. A lot of it, the actual most brutal aspects of these murders aren't shown, obviously aren't shown. Like, there's not a blatant, straightforward graphic shot of the most graphic parts of what Jack the Ripper does, which if you've seen this movie or know his story, you know what I'm talking about. That a lot of that stuff is just implied, or kind of you can see his figure from a distance kneeling over a laid out body, and you can kind of guess at what's going on just by the positioning of things and how things are edited, and then of course the dialogue afterwards and before and throughout the whole movie and all that type of stuff. So the power of suggestion is strong. You don't have to actually show a lot of gore to get the brutality of the act across to the viewer. So they do well at that, while also having moments where they just straightforward show you some kind of brutal shots. Lots of throats getting slit. There's one time a woman gets her throat slit, and the way it's shown is just very just right there. And it's like, I've seen plenty throats get slit in movies, but this is actually stands out as one of the more kind of brutal shots, like brutal kind of ways to see it, how it kind of visually looked, and this is a very visceral film. So but I think that is a positive for this movie, because you gotta kind of, this is the material you're working with. It's brutal stuff that happens, so it's going to be brutal stuff that happens in the movie. Now, what I will also say, this movie makes me think a lot about Sleepy Hollow, which also starred Johnny Depp and was also a very kind of gothic era type film. Sleepy Hollow took place in around 1799, I believe, and From Hell takes place around 1889, 1888, something like that. So obviously, a big chunk of time difference between the two kind of stories. Obviously, From Hell deals with Jack the Ripper. Sleepy Hollow deals with the Headless Horseman. So two totally different iconic villains and all that type of stuff. So it is kind of, there are obvious differences between the two, but aesthetically they both make me think of the other, because of obviously Johnny Depp playing an inspector of sorts, and then the gothic mood, a lot of the kind of the clothing and attire, the architecture, the visuals, all of that type of stuff. But Sleepy Hollow, and I did a review on the movie and kind of mentioned this in the review. Sleepy Hollow is a little bit or a lot more lighthearted than I thought it was going to be before I saw it. From Hell almost feels like an adult version of Sleepy Hollow. Like, it's just straightforward. Sleepy Hollow is kind of like a Halloween type, gothic type fantasy film that still has an element of friendly fun, harmless fun to it. Even in the stuff that's graphic, there's an element of kind of just Tim Burton zaniness to it. It's not so much a just dark horror film. From Hell is like a dark horror film. It steps confidently into the R rating, the blood, the brutality, all of that type of stuff. The unsavory, dirty elements of some of the things that are presented in this world. So it's kind of an interesting transition, you know, going from Sleepy Hollow to From Hell. I think those movies are very closely connected for me just because of that, the whole aesthetic aspect of it. So I'm actually going to I'll leave the review there. My score for From Hell, I'm going to actually have to go 8 out of 10 for this. It just, the things that worked for this movie, about this movie, really worked for me. And I just have to I got to give it that credit. 8 out of 10. That's where I'm sitting at for From Hell. I'd be really interested to see what a lot of the other kind of horror fans and things like that. I'd be really interested to see what some of them, you know, or some of you guys, if you happen to be checking this out, I'd be really interested to see what folks think about From Hell. I don't hear anybody talk. I haven't heard anybody talk about that movie. And to me, it's a very underrated kind of piece of horror cinema. So I'd be interested to see what people think about that. So that's it for me. 8 out of 10 for From Hell, 2001, starring Johnny Depp and Heather Graham, directed by the Hughes brothers, which still boggles my mind to even say that. I had no idea they made this movie, but they did a great job at it. So props to them. That's it, you guys. Thank you for watching. More to come as always. I will catch you on the next go round.